For those of you who may be new and do not know who I am, my name is Grace Ellens, and I am the Director of Development for the School of Theology and Seminary. A couple things before we get going in your packets. You'll see a schedule, and Bill will determine when he breaks with his presentation, but it should be roughly around 10-ish. Restrooms. There's one if you go out the back door there, straight ahead there's a restroom. Or if you go out this door here, there's one straight ahead or to your left, or you go upstairs and down the hall. And now, without any further delay, it is definitely my honor to introduce to you our speaker for today. He has been serving as our dean since 1999. Great leadership going on, as you all know. He completed his MAR and his PhD in systematic theology at Yale University. He serves on the board of the Society of Arts in Religious and Theological Studies, the Louisville Institute, and the Commission on Accrediting of Association of Theological Schools. So please join me in welcoming Dr.
Well, thank you. And I want to join Grace in thanking you all for coming after we had to cancel because of weather. You know, you never know, and then the sunshine. So when the weather's bad, we don't want people to come, and the weather's good, you got other things to do. It's amazing that you're here. But really, I do want to say just how delighted we are that this Theology Day program has grown the way it has over the years. Mentioned this to some of you before, but I know that some of you were here when we'd have 20 in the South Lounge, and that was a good day. And remember, there was one day, I think we had 14 because it was about 25 below, and that's when you know who really cares. No, but it's wonderful, and it means a lot to us. It's a big part of our mission as a school. Part of it just grew out of the realization that while we're aware that we have lots of needs as an institution and as a school, and you know, if you hear us talk about those, but more than anything, we are a resource, an asset. We aren't just a center of need, we're a center of resources, and we need to make those resources available for the whole church, and not just sit back and wait for people to come to us, but are there things we can do to help feed people. And our hope is to, kind of our development philosophy is to lead by giving in that sense. Start by giving people something. If it's an experience of value, we'll get our fair share back. People will do what they can. But so it's a delight to us that you care. And the other thing is, it's just deeply moving for me to know that there are so many people who are willing to give half a day to think more deeply about their Christian faith and what it means to them. I mean, this is just truly inspiring to those of us who do this work. And so I really appreciate that, and thank you for your inspiration of me and of us as an organization. So let me get to our topic for the day. Responsibility, leadership, and change. The topic alone is long, right? The challenges of an adult church. It's kind of like when you do like strategic planning and you're supposed to write a mission statement, right? And everybody says, well, it's got to be brief, 25 words or less. Well, brevity is hard for me. So I'm struggling with the board, and I say, okay, 25 words, but look, our name is 8 St. John's University School of Theology and Seminary. I mean, I've lost a third of my mission statement. Come on. Well, anyhow, so the title. But we'll look at all these elements, and the idea here is, what does it mean? Ultimately, the theme is, what does it mean to be an adult Catholic or an adult Christian? The focus will be on the Catholic Church, and I suspect most of us are Roman Catholic. I know from talking with friends in other Christian denominations that these dynamics play out there just in different ways, but the pastors have similar frustrations with people have frustrations with their pastors, and da-da-da. But there are particular ways this plays out in the Roman Catholic Church, and the idea is, are there systemic forces at work that tend to keep the baptized thinking they should be children in order to be authentic? And one of the things, and we'll look at some history and then we'll look at some leadership theory, and the handouts are coming around. to give you a sense of where we're going. And there'll be a break, as Grace said. It ends up being, the talk is in sort of 3 parts of very unequal length, a bit of scripture reflection at the beginning, sort of a history of the church in an hour or so, and then some talk on leadership theory. And so a couple ground rules. If you need to get up and use the restroom, let me know. If it's getting long, if I lose track of the time, just wave and we can take a break. I'm very responsive to that. But I will try to monitor the time. And there's an intermission built in, but if it gets too long, we'll just stop sooner. And the other thing is, feel free at any time to ask a question, raise your hand, get my attention. Chances are I'll complete my sentence, my thought, and then call on you. But if you just get so excited and can't wait and just blurt something out, that's okay. I can handle it, and we'll go with that. I see it as my job to kind of orchestrate this so that we get the main points covered by the time we close. You don't have to worry about that. I don't want you to self-edit too much, because the more interactive, the better. The other thing is, my practice is that people who haven't spoken yet go to the top of the line. So it isn't just the order in which a hand goes up, but if somebody hasn't talked and there's 4 hands already up, they go first if those people have spoken. Just so you know I'm not dissing you or I'm mad about your last comment or something like that. Okay, let's see if this works. Good. All right. An image from the Bible, back to our title. Okay, I want to begin with this passage. And it's a fairly familiar one. It's in your text. At that time, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" He called the child whom he put among them and said, "Truly I tell you, unless you change and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever becomes humble like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me." Okay. What do you hear in this passage? Simplicity. Say again? Humility. Open. A sense of wonder. You and Aristotle are on the same page. I'll come back to that. Yeah. Innocence, yes. Become innocent. At unexpected answers. Okay, that's what children give. Yeah, not only unexpected answers. Don? Say again? Curious, yeah. Some unexpected questions come too. Right. Trust and love. Yes. Say more about that. Yes. Childlike, and that's what it says, childlike, not childish. What's the difference? If I ask you, what does it mean to be childish? What comes to mind? Immature? Self-centered? Dependent? Foolish? Frantic? Oh, bratty. Yeah. Right. Whiny? Yeah. Narrow and shallow? Yep. Okay, not so positive. Yeah, and it's an important difference. This is about being childlike, not being childish. Okay. The wonder piece, the Aristotle, the beginning of Aristotle's metaphysics, he talks about the origin of philosophy, the first page. And he says, philosophy begins with wonder. And if you don't have wonder, you won't be a philosopher. And I think the idea is that it opens us up to receive, so to be childlike. Okay, and the other part of this is that it's whoever becomes humble like this child. The idea of becoming like a child is very different than just being a child. This would be something that adults do, and that gets at an attitude and so on. Okay. In this, we could use this as a way into some reflections on theological language. And I'll be brief here, but I think this is very important, actually. That theological language is metaphorical. And you could make a case that ultimately all language is metaphorical, that it's rooted in something, some tangible experience, and we use that to apply to other things and so on. But certainly theological language. And the metaphor part of it would be where we say the lake is glass, kind of like today maybe. Okay, I know there may be some English teachers here. Anybody, any English teachers? Okay, the whole metaphor simile thing, I'm not interested in that. So just we'll use this is actually right. If you have like or as, that's a metaphor, and without it, it's a simile, or the other way. Okay, yeah, other way around. Good. Anyhow, but it's the comparative part. Okay, and I think one of the dangers of theological language is a kind of incipient fundamentalism, if you will, that's more pervasive than just this business of the 6 days or something like that. But it's a failure to recognize the metaphorical character of theological language. If we take seriously the fact that God is other, God is truly other. He isn't just like very, 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 very human. He's other. She's other. God's other. And so then God is totally other, and we say God is not sensory. God can't be sensed in that direct way. And yet human knowing, I guess here I'm more of an Aristotelian, but let's say human knowing is rooted somehow, we know, in tangible experience. I mean, we sense things, we touch things. That's where our ideas come from, it's where our words come from, our concepts, and then we try to apply those somehow to that which is not to be sensed. So Thomas Aquinas, in the 1200s, his teacher, Albert the Great, had rediscovered Aristotle. The Europeans had rediscovered Aristotle. I imagine this great episode in Western cultural history in some bar in Spain. Because what happened, you maybe know, Aristotle, other than a couple of his writings, Ethics and the Logic, was lost. We had this long list of his books, and it was Socrates, who didn't write anything, who taught Plato, and then Plato taught Aristotle, okay, about 400 years before Christ. But so we have this list. We know Aristotle's great, but his writings are lost. Well, it turns out the Muslims had them and had translated them into Arabic and so on. And then the Muslims, they're in Spain, and then they're kind of being driven out around the 1100s, 1200s, this exchange back and forth. And so I imagine this sort of European Christian person, a couple of them, sitting in some bar with some Muslim scholars, and they're tipping back a Spanish wine, and the one guy, the Muslim, says, "Yeah, last night I was reading Aristotle's Metaphysics," and the other guy says, "What? That's been lost for 1,000 years. Yeah, I got it back home on my nightstand." Whoa! And so begins the transformation of Western thought in a bar. So, no, I have no idea if that's how it happened, but I like to think of it that way. But then, so Aquinas is trying to use Aristotle, who's an empiricist, very different than Plato. Christian theology has used Plato for 1,000 years. There's a point to this. And Aristotle says, no, knowledge begins with sensory experience. Plato had said we begin with these ideas in our head. Well, all of the theologians of Aquinas' day said, you can't do theology like this. I mean, just think about it, Thomas. You're saying, A, God cannot be sensed. B, human knowing begins with sensory experience. The only conclusion is, C, you've made knowledge of God impossible. He says, well, give me a chance. Let's just see how this goes. And after he died, his own bishop in Paris, Stephen Tempier, condemned some of his major theses. It's a little unseemly to wait till after the guy dies to take him on. But anyhow, but it was over this issue. Well, whether you're a strict Thomist, Aristotelian or not, I think the general consensus is that human knowing and human language are rooted in our experience of the world, and God is other. Hence, our talk about God is metaphor. And the challenge is, like this, we say the lake is glass. Let's imagine you're kind of goofing around, doing something, and you fall through your patio door, and you break the glass. And Coy said, the lake is glass. We're driving out there. I'm going to cut out a piece, and I'm going to fix my patio door. Well, no, you took the wrong thing literally. That wasn't the point. But we do that a lot when we talk about God. What's the metaphor? What's to be taken literally and left behind? What is it pointing to? And it actually gets far more complicated, because you may be thinking about really contentious issues, which we can talk about if you want, like gender. Okay, God is male and female. Well, if God's other, he's not either one. Okay, but when we think of a lot of our language about God, our most powerful language of God, the metaphor is not really about God. And I should have a blackboard here. But so imagine, let's say God is, we liken God to the Good Shepherd, okay? Now you could say the comparison is God to a shepherd. But that's not really the comparison. The comparison is a ratio. God is to God's people the way a shepherd is to sheep. What's being compared is that relationship and the character and quality of that relationship. We're not saying God is a shepherd. We're talking about the quality of the relationship. So too when we say God is Father. It's not about the fatherhood of God. It's about God relates to God's people the way a good father relates to his children. And so too a mother. And we look at that, and metaphors of the church, they're almost always about the way we relate. But then you get some things, you start talking about, especially in gender issues, masculine, feminine roles, and you get into all this active, passive stuff, and you start to think, wait a minute, aren't you kind of like going out there and trying to cut glass out of the lake? It's structurally the same thing. You're literalizing the poetry of the metaphor, and in doing so, you're reducing the grandeur and otherness of God. And it's really an issue, in some ways, of the first commandment. So we don't very often, many of us, make a statue and worship it and demand some kind of fealty to that statue we have made. But I think the theological temptation, my occupational hazard as a theologian, and there are many, but one of them is to take the conceptual constructs we make about God and make them an idol. Forget that they're a metaphor, absolutize them, and demand the kind of obedience and fealty, loyalty to this concept that we have made, rather than using it as one way to the richness of God. And I think one tribute to the richness of an experience, whether it's God, whether it's your relationship with your spouse, with your children, with your parents, your grandchildren, the richer this reality, the less adequate is any single metaphor to naming it. And so you need to use a lot of them. So Christmas time, we sing Handel's Messiah, even though it was written for Easter. But at the beginning, it's King of Kings, Lord of Lords, like these names from Isaiah are just spilling out. You can't think of enough names. You can't say them fast enough or beautifully enough. And at the end, they're all still inadequate to the reality you're trying to name. But you've got to say something. So that's theological language. That's the joy of doing theology. But it's also where we get into lots of problems. So back to the idea that Christ is the good shepherd, and then we're the sheep. as the church, and what does that mean? And so sheep are kind of dumb and barely obedient, and you try to fleece them every so often. I mean, there's a lot of ways in which this metaphor runs amok real fast. Okay, is and is not. Implicit in all of these metaphors is both an is character and an is not. So the lake is glass, but you also learn that it is not. And you need to know how to apply both of those. What is being affirmed, what is being negated. That would be true of, I would say, any theological claim we would make. So, one of the most sacred, clearest, I would say, for me, without qualification, Jesus is God. Okay. But as I say to my students in Christology, it doesn't mean you can substitute the word God in every sentence where Jesus appears and have a proper sentence theologically. There's also an is not. And so would I say God has 10 toes? No. Well, what applies, what doesn't? The is and the is not. The bread, the consecrated bread in the Eucharist is the body of Christ. But you can't do an autopsy, you can't do DNA. There's a lot of is not also. Theologically, Paul Tillich, a great Protestant Lutheran theologian of the 20th century, and it's important that he's not Catholic here, made a distinction between Catholic substance and Protestant principle. And he says the Catholic substance focuses on the is. It is the affirmation that God is with us. I mean, that sounds to me like we got the better end of that deal. That's a good story to have. The Protestant principle is the prophetic reminder that God is God and you're not. God is with us, and that sets up the temptation in human affairs to always sort of take God for granted, make it feel like we have God in our pocket, we're controlling God, and we need that reminder that the prophets had in the Old Testament about the is not. But this is also not God. It's a reminder of the first commandment. And that the church needs both. And he says it doesn't have to be divided into two churches that don't talk to each other. That's actually unhealthy. They're both going to run amok. If you have the Protestant principle without the Catholic substance, you can't just protest all the time. And this was a Lutheran saying this. But the Catholics, without the Protestant reminder, that's kind of the whole problem that we have in the history of human religion. So, is and is not, and we'll see that throughout. Well, let me pause here and see if questions on those kind of big meta-theological questions. But I think that's very helpful. Yeah?
There is a metaphor that I find awful, kind of I like to call it, God is love.
Ah.
He abides in love, abides in God and God in him.
Right.
It seems to me that there's an almost equality there.
Yeah, it seems to be, that's a great example. That's probably the one that is maybe the least metaphorical. The more philosophical theologians would say, well, when we say God is being, there's no metaphor there. That's a literal association. I'm just suspicious. And so I think on the God is love one, the metaphors, the challenge is always projection. So we have an experience of love and we assume this is how God loves. Now there's got to be some connection, some is, or it's just nonsense. We could say God is bungalda, and if it's not love the way we know love in some way, we're not saying anything. And yet the way God loves may not be exactly the way we love. So there may be a certain is not character, and I think part of the Christian life is figuring that all out. I mean, so I thought it meant I could ask anything and I'd get my way. Well, no, for one thing, that's not good love even as a parent, that you misunderstood love. But part of the whole life is being educated into the way that God loves. and then to say, go out and do likewise. But I think you're right. That's maybe the one where there's, like, if you will, the most overlap, the least is not character of that, and the least danger of really, how can you go bad? Okay, one more passage and then we'll move on. So this was St. Paul, and kind of pushing in a slightly different direction. And Paul says, when I was a child, I spoke like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. When I became an adult, I put an end to childish, back to that, the childish ways. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then we will see face to face. Now I know only in part, then I will know fully, even as I have been fully known. Here's St. Paul, and there's other passages that you may remember from St. Paul where he talks about, uses a distinction of starting off with kind of the milk of Christian formation and moving to the meat as you grow up, and this sense that there's a maturing in the Christian life and that we're called to be adults. And properly understood, this idea and Christ's passage, Christ's comment, are not at odds. But on the surface, they seem to be pulling in opposite directions. And the challenge, I think, that many of us face, I think it's something that college students face as kind of go through adolescence. And then as we go through our lives, how to be a fully formed, responsible adult and be a Catholic. Now, I want to say one more thing about the system before we look at history here. I'm not one at all who, well, let me put it another way. I think human agency is real and significant and sort of irreducible. Human freedom, human agency, and that we are responsible for shaping our lives. But at the same time, we know that there are lots of forces that work on us. And if we don't actively take control of our lives, those forces will shape us in certain directions. And I'm studiously avoiding a little sidetrack into Soren Kierkegaard there. But anyhow, but we are, there are these forces. And they are at work in the church. And they're at work on all of us. And I think part of what I want to do as we go through the history is look at how these forces came to be, because I think they create a certain dynamic, a certain inertia, in the sense that it'll continue in this direction unless it's acted upon to change. And if we don't understand the inertial forces in the system, whether that be a physical system or a human system, if we don't understand those forces and how they're at work, we're suckers, and we're prone to have them act upon us and grind us down, because we can spend a lot of our energy on the wrong things. So we at least need to know what they are. I'm not claiming that we're the products of them, that they're controlling us or anything like that, but they do work on us, and I think we need to be aware of that. And the other thing is, they work on all of us. The Pope, the bishop, the cardinals, the priests, the lay people, all of us can be caught up in this and feel we have roles to play in this system that maybe we never really even thought about and may not even like. But we'll get more to that, but just so that context there. All right. Historical reflection. So how did we get here? Well, let me check the time here. All right. So go from the gospel to the present in about 60 minutes. So we've got, I don't know, about 2 minutes a century, maybe, something like that. 45 if we can do it. So be sort of brief, but then please expand things as you want. If you want more, let me know, because you can't really make me be briefer, but you can make me be longer. So I'll try to be relatively brief as we go through. So at the beginning, so the first century, right? Jesus dies, rises, leaves. The church is on its own with the Spirit in Pentecost. So after that, but in the time of the New Testament, the first, let's say, first century and a half or so, the church is meeting in people's homes. A principal catalyst for this, it seems, actually are women in the community. in some ways, Rome was a very patriarchal society, but women also were responsible in many ways for the home life. It's a kind of relationship many of us would know. If you were going to have some gathering in your home, chances are it would be the woman of the family who would arrange that and make it happen. And that happened in a lot of these house churches. Now, that fact does not mean these women were priests or anything of the kind. There's no evidence of that, but they were conveners, evidence maybe of deacons, but not of priests as far as I know. But the church was gathering in these homes. It was very much a kind of adult situation. I mean, this was adults were converted. When Paul and others preached, they were preaching to adults. And it was these adults who made this Christianity live. Now, I should say there were children who became Christian in a couple different ways. One was if the head of household converted, everybody in the household converted. The children, the slaves, everybody. And so you would have Christian children. Or we see this already in Paul, talking about people marrying and having children, and they're Christians, and so their children are Christian. There's an ambiguous practice. Infant baptism, some places not. The concern about baptism was partly related to adulthood, but more related to the fact that we hadn't worked out yet the sacrament of penance, or reconciliation. So the church was unclear what you did with sins committed after baptism. So you the ideal was you deferred your baptism till the last possible minute. You're on your deathbed, you're baptized, you die, and you're right in there like a spiritual flume, right into heaven. Augustine, in his confession, tells about a friend who was really, really sick and he was dying, and so they baptized him. Excuse me, and this would have been in the 300s still. So they baptize him, and the guy gets better. And he's all mad at his friends because he said, "No, I can't do anything." And, it was great. Some things just never change, From the earliest time, there's evidence of priests and bishops. There's no evidence that there was originally a church without this, and these things came in later. What seems to be the development, and I'm not a historian or an expert here, but what seems to make most sense is that you had bishops. So like Paul would be in a city, he'd preach, he'd leave somebody behind, delegate him to be in charge. That becomes the episkopoi, the overseer, the bishop. Well, eventually these communities grow. The bishop can't be every place, so the bishop delegates people to represent him in other communities around, and that's where you get the bishop and the priest and kind of the equivalent of a diocesan structure, an area, until you run in at some neighboring group where you're meeting delegates from a priest in the town over, and then you say, I guess this is the line, you're in charge here. So you can kind of see how this sort of grows organically. But there's clearly an authority structure. There was some election or public affirmation of bishops for a long time, actually well into the Middle Ages. In some places this was more active than others. But there's all these stories in the first 3-4 centuries of a group of people, they want this person to be bishop, and he doesn't want to be bishop, and they keep hauling him back into church. There's one story where I think it's with Augustine actually, they lock the doors until he agrees to say, "I'll be your bishop." They won't let him out. So the people are involved, but even though there's a very significant role for the baptized, there's always the evidence of the consecration of the laying on of hands with 3 other bishops. So it's this interaction of the public affirmation, identification, desire, calling of someone, and that being recognized by other bishops for this. It was also a time of persecution and martyrdom, as you know. It wasn't like this persecution was universal and unrelenting throughout the empire. It was very episodic and regional too, but it could happen anytime. You knew that the governor could wake up one morning and just decide things are bad, I need to divert attention, or and he gives a speech that our troubles are being caused by these Christians and we're going to round them up, they're unfaithful to our common heritage, and then you round up some and you kill them. So it was a very common part of life, something you had to worry about, and it clearly kept your motivation clear. If you weren't serious about the gospel, why would you join a group when you could be killed for joining? I mean, okay. Now, the other thing that happens is that the church is adopting Greek and Roman understandings of the world and society. Would say the single most momentous decision in the history of the church, I think, is the one made about what Paul calls the Judaizers, the Council of Jerusalem in Acts 15. If you remember the context, and Paul writes about this in some of his letters, especially Galatians, he'll go into a town and preach, and his pattern was he always preached first to the Jews, and if the synagogue people kicked him out, then he went and preached to the Gentiles. But the Jews hear it first, then the Gentiles, and if Gentiles convert, he baptizes them, or has them baptized. Well, then these other folks would come in behind him and say, you can't do that, you need to first be Jewish. And the Judaizers, as they're called, who get sort of a bad rap, of course, because Paul wins, but if you look at their logic, they've got a lot going for them. I mean, Jesus is a Jew. All of the apostles are Jewish. As far as we know, every person Jesus called to follow him was a Jew. And it isn't that there weren't Gentiles around. There were Gentiles there. If he wanted to follow them, or wanted to call them, he could have, and he didn't. So clearly, he didn't want Gentiles to be disciples. That's pretty obvious. And in the whole history of the church, granted 40 years, but in the whole history of the church, every member has been a Jew. Now, if you're a Gentile and you want to become Christian, you first become Jewish. No, significant disincentive for adult males, but you first become Jewish, follow the law, and then from that you can be baptized and become Christian. Well, the church decides no. And what's interesting is the church decided against what seems to be the clear weight of Scripture and tradition. But they still felt that the Spirit was clearly calling. And the pivotal point in Acts 10, where smartly Luke has this done by Peter and not Paul, in the narrative in Acts, Peter baptizes the first Gentile. And it's Cornelius. And the whole thing with the sheets and what God has made clean, no, we shouldn't make unclean, etc. And so he preaches. He enters the Gentile house. He preaches. They respond. And then they say, what should we do? And Peter says, how can we withhold the waters of baptism from those who have clearly already received the Spirit? And I think that sets up two things. But first, a pattern in which the church structures are always racing to keep up to the work of the Spirit in the church. And I think that's exactly what we see now. And we've talked about that in terms of lay ministry, for instance. But the other is more related here. The Gentiles, in this case it would be Greeks or Romans, more Greek philosophically, Roman kind of politically and so on. But they didn't have to first become Jewish in order to be Christian. And what that means is they can bring in their cultural understandings and try to integrate it with the gospel. Enculturation really begins right away. It's part of the mediation of the otherness of God. It's a very incarnational, sacramental role, and culture is there, and we don't always get it right. I mean, we adopted Greek and Roman understandings, and part of that was we accepted slavery because it was accepted there, and we just didn't make a big deal of it. We should have. That was wrong. It's a very patriarchal society, and we accepted certain roles about women. Well, that's being challenged as well. But this whole idea, the role of society becomes important and becomes a major part of our understanding as we go forward. And my position would be that this is unavoidable. There is no non-enculturated embodiment of the gospel. And at the same time, the culture is not the gospel. Kind of like the metaphor, the is and the is not. But sometimes after long association, you lose sight of the culture. So we can think, I think we've gotten better at this, but say in the 1950s and 60s, when we first started becoming aware of this, the idea was that, yeah, when we talk about enculturation, it's about all these other cultures, like the church going into Africa and Asia and India and other places. That's where we have to think about how culture is interacting with the gospel, as if the European cultural form of the gospel was not culture. This was gospel. No, it's as much cultural. And that doesn't mean it's bad. Doesn't mean it's bad, doesn't mean it's good. It's just the way it is. In that sense, it's very sacramental, as I was saying. Okay, but that will shape our self-understanding, and this sets up certain dynamics that we'll see as we go forward. All right, the rest of these can be more, we can go more quickly. Christianity gets established in the Roman Empire, 312, the Emperor Constantine converts. And if the idea that if you're the head of the household, the whole household converts, well, the emperor is like the head of the household of state. So does the whole state convert? Well, he didn't do that right away, but eventually it happens. 325, he calls the Council of Nicaea. Interesting, the emperor calls the council, not the pope, and trying to unify the church over the Arian controversy and so on. By the end of the century, the Emperor Theodosius makes Christianity the official religion of the empire, and he outlaws paganism. So you go from right here in about 295, I think it was Diocletian, had a major persecution of Christians. You go from you could be killed if you were a Christian to a time if you wanted a good civil service job in the empire, you had to be baptized. It changes things. You get people joining for lots of mixed reasons. I'm not impugning anyone's motives. It would just be naive to think that the motives aren't more mixed now than they were before. And in this, the church takes on lots of structures of the Roman Empire and natural ways, particularly for our purposes, in how authority works. And so the Bishop of Rome begins to be called Pontifex Maximus, which was a title used for the Roman Emperor. And that's just what they had. It was the concepts they had available, and they used them. So I don't think that's necessarily bad, but just because it fits one era doesn't mean it's going to fit another. In 410, Rome burns. Now, this connection was not lost on some of the residual pagans in the Roman Empire. That in 395, paganism is outlawed, and 15 years later, the eternal city is in flames. They said, look, our ancestors told us, as long as we are faithful to the gods of our fathers, those gods will protect us. We have written them off, and the city's in flames. Makes sense to me. So Augustine writes this massive city of God to say, no, that's really not it. There's all this other stuff going on in the Roman Empire, and those gods are just superstition, and here it was this decay from within, and so on. But this had a traumatic effect. I don't know if we can really imagine what it would be like, because this really was the eternal city. It was the shining outpost of civilization. It was everything. It has, running water and plumbing and wheat coming in to feed 1 million people from all over. It's an amazing thing. And all of a sudden, it's burning. It was devastating. Now, part of what happens as the empire starts to crumble, and it was crumbling, this didn't happen overnight. The borders were coming back, and those barbarian Germans were coming in, ruining everything for those nice Italian boys and girls. But anyhow, so they saw this coming, and part of what happens is the social structure falls apart. When the empire burns, and we continue to have an emperor in the West for a couple hundred years, but it's never the same after this. Of course, in the east, one of the things Constantine did, is divide the empire kind of right a little bit west of Greece, to the border of Greece down there. And east of that, where people spoke Greek, where the capital was Constantinople. And then the Western Empire, the capital was Rome. It just got too hard to manage the whole thing. Well, the Eastern Empire, so Rome burns here in 410. The Eastern Empire, Constantinople, doesn't fall to the Muslims until 1452, I think it is. So another 1,000 years after this, the empire lives in the East. It's amazing. Anyhow, what happens is, if you think of, so you're in some, once fine town in France or North Africa, and all of your social political structures have broken down, and you're the bishop there. And the plumbing doesn't work, and there's nobody picking up the garbage, and how do you get food into the people in town? The only likely candidate for some intercity connections, something that's more than local, is the church. So as good pastors, the bishops and the priests are going to start running the town. Say, okay, we can get water in here. Why would you sit back and say, I don't think that's our job? If you're the only person who's able to do that, you should do it. And so I think this doesn't start as like people sitting around, in my estimation of this, thinking, ooh, this is a great way for us to seize power. No, people are hungry. We can get them food. I'm going to get word to my friend, the bishop over here, who has a lot of food that he doesn't know what to do with. I've got people who don't have food. We can make this work. Now, of course, a couple centuries later, when the socio-political system comes back, they're not as eager to give up that power. But that's another whole story. That's, it's just more complicated. What happens, too, at this time, a feudal system emerges, which is this interlocking relationship of lord and vassal. So at the most local level, I think the basic exchange, and they didn't really necessarily put it this way, this is projecting back social contract and so on, but the basic exchange would be, I can farm this land, I don't own it. Let's say, Don owns a couple thousand acres, and he can't farm it all, only has one son, and it's all subsistence farming. So there's a bunch of us serfs. My people are serfs as far back as we know. And we're farming the land, and we give him a percentage in tax, and we keep some. And then the other thing that he provides is this castle, and when these marauding bandits come through, we can all go in the castle and we'll be safe. So this, he gives us safety, gives us land, we give him this. And when he goes to war, unfortunately, we have to go off and go to war. And then he has a lord over him and a lord over that. And this interlocking system just goes up and down. It's a very, very hierarchical system. And family-based, clan-based. You know how this works. But the key for the moment is it's extremely hierarchical. And the idea is that power clearly flows from the top down in this system. Education declines with the fall of Rome. I think one of the ways that the best way I know of in terms of a metaphor to get at the difference between, say, medieval mindset, which we could say from here till about maybe 1600 or so, and a modern mindset is the Pantheon in Rome. I know many of you have been there. I suspect it's the first was pagan temple, Pantheon with many gods, and it became a Christian church and still standing. It's beautiful, circular in a square, and in the middle of this dome is a hole. So you have a dome with a hole in the middle. And for centuries, the smartest people in Europe, when they did their tour and would go to Rome, would walk in this building and stand here and say, there were once people who walked this earth who knew how to build this. I don't. We can't. There is nobody alive today who can build this. We will be lucky to preserve the legacy of the past. So a sense of tradition and an attitude towards the past where there was a golden age in the past. that gave us a deposit of teaching, truth, whatever it might be, and our primary job is to stop the deterioration. If we can just keep it from getting worse, if I can pass on to the next generation what was given to me, that will be a major achievement. Because so far, every generation has gotten dumber and dumber, or known less and less. That's not the right way to put it, but it's going down. Like, we used to have all these writings from Aristotle. All we know now is they're gone. We've got a list. We don't have them. So that sense then of the deposit from the past. I mean, now, okay, this is my Southern stereotype, but I think I can just only think of this best with some guy from Texas, right? Dallas in particular, who walks into that Pantheon, big, like J.R. Ewing or something, big hat on, and looks up and says, we got one of these back home. It's way bigger. And it's got a bigger hole up there. We got air conditioning. You couldn't play football in this place. I mean, the sense is, yeah, the past is nice, but we're bigger, better, faster. Everything in the future, in the present is better than the past, and the future is going to be better. That's the modern attitude, and that is a huge transformation in how we think of ourselves, our relationship to the past, the present, and the future. And I think a big part of what is catching the church is that we have those two forces colliding. And that doesn't mean that we should have a disrespect for the past. It doesn't mean that there isn't something like a deposit of faith and a revelation that actually is given by God and not ours to change. But it also means that we may not have to be stuck in this kind of mindset where our attitude is, boy, nobody can do what they used to do in the past. Those were the good old days. Okay. In this context, I've got to get my plug in here, monasticism arises. Benedict dies in 543, and the empire's decaying. He's studying, gets frustrated. Many of you can tell this story better than I. And he goes off and founds the community. Well, he goes off to live by himself, and then people come to him. Lest we think this is all sweetness and light, his initial community tried to kill him. All organizations have their problems. I haven't at least had that yet as dean, but maybe that'll come. I'm not having a muffin. No. So monasticism. But in terms of our kind of unfolding story here, I think, and before Benedict, there were monks out in the desert. As the motivation got more mixed, people who wanted to take their Christianity seriously thought there's got to be more to it, and they would go to the desert to wrestle with demons, even if they couldn't be persecuted and so on. But in terms of the community here, this is a really interesting move on the part of the institutional church. And I'm not claiming that anybody was aware of this at the time, but the abbot and a monastic community don't fit immediately under the episcopal structure. So for instance, here at St. John's, Bishop Kinney can't assign priests from the abbey to serve parishes. He works with the abbot to do that, but the abbot has a kind of local jurisdiction. He's in the episcopal structure and yet sort of out of it. An abbot can wear a mitre. Unfortunately, it's not at all the same for women's communities, but that's another matter for the moment. Not unimportant, just another matter. But what the church did, I think, it set up these little groups that can function sort of off to the side. And I thought of this, and we'll loop back to this at the end, but I thought of it a bit like what little I know about, say, Google, and I think AT&T had this place. A lot of these tech companies will set up groups. Bell Labs, for instance, was this. And they're off to the side, and they put some of their brightest people in here. Now they'll mix them up. They'll have designers and engineers and all kinds of folks. And they say, just come up with some ideas. They just, that's it. We're going to just leave you alone. 80% of it's probably going to be just garbage, right? But the next great idea is going to come from over here. We're paying for this. We're getting it all supported. Meanwhile, we're going about our business. We're selling the products we have. We're doing all this. And then these things loop back in at times when there's a need. And I think these religious communities function like that. They can fly a little under the radar. Smart bishops don't supervise them too much because it takes away the genius and the gift. There's an obligation here. They're not like a totally separate company. But in the history of the church, when some new things have been needed, those flowers have been growing in these other places here, and the fruit's ready. It's an amazing history, and I think that's a big part. And this is a truly inspired move, and something I want to make sure we give credit to in a church that can be very hierarchical and look like it's only interested in control. This was not a control move. This was a creativity move, and I think that's significant. Okay. Now we skip, like so many church historians, 1,000 years. Jump to Luther. Luther publishes his 95 Theses in 1517. His concern are abuses in the church. I mean, you know much of this. His basic underlying concern, really theologically, is about idolatry, as I mentioned before. The idea that humans are placed on par with God, or what he identifies as human creations are made equal to God's gifts. And whether that's our work, whether that's our tradition, our teaching, etc., now whether he got that all right is another matter, but that's his underlying concern. And so in his view, things like tradition, hierarchy, saints, sacraments, what we as Catholics and the church at the time certainly understood as means of grace, channels of grace, he thought had become obstacles to the encounter with God in Christ. Maybe they've just become so encrusted over time. There's a lot of ways, if you think of sort of the pipe plumbing system model of grace, and there's kind of roots have grown in there, needs to be cleared out, but whatever, he thinks of these as an obstacle. Or in the sense of, there's two different ways you can think of the role of a bureaucrat, and I don't mean that in a negative way at the moment, but a bureaucrat, okay, civil servant. And you can imagine the story of a king and a courtier. Soren Kierkegaard tells it this way. And the one courtier, he could see his role as he's the interface between the people and the king. That's his power. So he never really wants to leave anybody alone with the king. So I'll take your message to the king. What do you want? Now, yep, I'll tell it. Even if he does it faithfully, doesn't distort, he's the only one the king sees. And so he inserts himself always in that relationship. There's another that would see their role as facilitating a more immediate relationship between the citizen and the king, and they either facilitate that and get out of the way or stand shoulder to shoulder rather than in between. I think Luther's concern was that the church had become more like that first courtier who was afraid to leave people alone with God. Now, I would say if that diagnosis is correct, we need the medicine. That's not how we understand church. And if we can intensify that a bit if you study what's called the history of religions, or kind of the nature of religion, as a human phenomenon, so just what religions do. For the most part, religions function as an intermediary between gods and the people. And you have priests who are these intermediaries. So if you think of Raiders of the Lost Ark, remember that movie? Okay. And at the end, there's this great scene where they actually get the ark, and there's these bad Nazis, right? And this one guy's just really bad. It's so great because the bad guys are really bad and the good guys are really good, and it's wonderful mythology. All right, they open this ark, and first it's nothing, and this one guy's mocking it, holding the sand, laughing at it, and then this swirl comes up, and this power goes around, and it comes across this evil Nazi who's been mocking the whole thing, and he's laughing, and this power melts his face off. It's gruesome, but fabulous. And I think part of the whole point in religion is to remember the God we deal with is a God who can melt your face off. I'm serious. Some of you maybe read C.S. Lewis, The Narnia Chronicles. So there's this character, this Christ character, Aslan, who's a lion. And he, in the third book, the two older children, there are 4 children, brothers and sisters, and they're leaving. Two of them are too old to go to Narnia again, and these 2 younger children are coming, and they're introducing them to Narnia and its ways. And they tell about Aslan, and the 2 newcomers say, "Oh, I get it. He's like a tame lion." I said, "No, he's not a tame lion at all. He's wild, but he won't hurt you because he loves you." And the temptation is, I think the theological temptation, another one of my occupational hazards, and the temptation of the entire religious enterprise is that we think what we've done is domesticated God, and we make God into a force we can control. So when I look back and think maybe I was made to be a theologian from my mother's womb or something, but I remember being an altar boy at this wonderful Benedictine parish up in Moorhead. This could easily have been with Father Ferdinand. Some of you know Ferdinand was a great pastor. Anyhow, but I remember being there, and we had one of these really nice tabernacles, and then after communion, everything's getting ready, and you're putting things back. And it had a key, and you turned the key a certain way, and the doors closed. Thunk. And I remember thinking, so we put God in a box, and we have the key. Now, grant you, it's a golden box. But I'm not sure God really cares that it's gold. And the idea that we have the key and we'll let him out when we're ready. No, this God will melt your face off. So the underlying idea of religion is that it's a dangerous thing to interact with these gods. We create rituals and structures and a class of people called priests who interact with them for us. They go into the temple where this melt your face off power resides and deal with it. And if you think of like Greek myths, when the gods come close to you, when they leave Olympus and come down, it's not good. They're raping your women, they ruin your crops, they start wars, they get people mad at each other, they stir things up just for fun. What we want is we want God to stay away, be happy, and leave us alone. Send us rain, send us kids, otherwise stay home. And it's the priest's job to make sure that happens. It is not the priest's job to bring God close. This is one of the radical differences in the understanding of what Christ does. Christ is an intermediary, not as a buffer to keep God away, which is how religion tended to work, but as a channel that brings God close right next to us. Now, of course, the story is, in the crucifix, our reaction is not, "Oh, hallelujah, at last you've come." No, our reaction is, "What are you doing here? We got this under control. Go away." And he won't go away. Well, look, this is not going to end well for you. And he still doesn't go away. So we kill him. So this is a very interesting relationship that we have here with God. And this whole, what is the role of the church in this as an intermediary? The human tendency is to make that intermediary one that is a whole mechanism for controlling God. Where it seems to me the message of the gospel is to make the intermediary of the church a way to make God present and enrich our lives. And we have mixed feelings about that, as the cross shows. Well, so one of the other things that Luther called for was individual readings of Scripture. So when you could leave people alone with God, you can leave them alone with the Word of God. And you have a congregational structure, which is actually more Calvin than Luther. He kept the bishops. But still a kind of congregational structure, all of which gives people more power over their religious life and identity. Go about 10 more minutes here, and then we'll take a break. The Catholic response to this, we were suspicious of individuals reading the Bible, and I think history shows there's lots of reasons to be suspicious. People come up with some pretty wacky things. I mean, don't do this, but you could go to any white supremacist website. It's absolutely disgusting, the connections they make to the gospel of Jesus Christ. Absolutely disgusting. I don't want them reading the Bible. We strengthened the role of the authority of bishops as interpreters of the text, the teaching authority. There was a focus on what differentiates us from Protestants. So the Council of Trent is, our response, the Catholic response to the Reformation. Very few bishops there, actually, but it's our response, and goes on for a long time. But ever since Trent, in the 1500s, there have been two things that have happened. One is the church becomes much more centered, as I say, in the authority of bishops and in a centralized way, and we'll see that over the next few centuries. The Middle Ages were a really diverse church. I mean, when we think about things, we use the phrase being more medieval. I think people don't know what they're talking about. Yeah, it was backwards in some ways. I don't know how to make the Pantheon medieval, but you had sort of stuff going on all over the place, and they didn't feel a huge need to control this. That was all right. And the other thing is that we began to think of what defines us as Catholics in terms of what makes us different from Protestants. And this goes deeply to our identity. Who are we? In a way, it's kind of like adolescents who go through a point where their identity is constructed by them saying, I am not like my parents. Okay, but you come to a point, most of us do, where you realize that's not the entirety of my identity. I may need that, but far more defining of who I am is probably all the ways I actually am like my parents and what I have in common. But that struggle with how this works. I wanted to give one example here. Kind of what this is about. So I taught at St. Mary's in Winona before I came here, and had this class called The Shaping of Catholicism. This kind of a class on the church. And about 35 people in there, some theology majors, about 6 or 7 undergraduate seminarians. They have a college seminary there. And so I said, okay, what is it that makes us Catholic? Or defining marks of being Catholic. And I'm writing this stuff on the board, and the Pope and Mary and Eucharist and the Rosary and all this. The board was getting full, and I stepped back and okay, is that pretty? We have everything. A couple more hands. Oh no, I add religious orders and this and that, and there were some smarty pants seminarians who got some really cool things. And okay, that was good. Step back. This is it. Yep. I said, okay, if I were to walk in the room and look at this list, it would say, Catholics don't believe in God. Nobody put God up there. I said, or Jesus Christ. They said, well, other people believe in God. I said, I didn't ask you what makes you different. I asked you what makes you Catholic. And they assumed those were the same questions. That what makes us different is what makes us Catholic. And for 500 years, in response to Protestants, Catholics focused on things that were different. And what can happen in that environment is that we end up highlighting things that are important but of secondary importance, and we make them of primary importance. So we spend a lot of effort on things like vestments. I mean, look how our priests and sisters dress. It's so different. These Protestants dress just like anybody. They have no sense of ritual. We have more art, and so you get these gaudy churches full of art, and we don't eat meat on Friday, and that defines us. Of course, then when Vatican II comes, we'll get to this in a moment, we try to reclaim our true identity. These things get relativized. They aren't eliminated. They're just made relatively important rather than defining, and this is traumatic. And it's understandable because we had allowed this to define us for several hundred years. Okay, now, what's happening in Europe at this time, 16th, 17th century, again, this is about how the church can learn from the culture, borrow from the culture, be shaped by the culture. We had an increasing centralization of authority. All these little principalities are coming together to form more and more nation states. We have the idea of the divine right of kings. If God didn't want Charles to be king, he would not have born him to Elizabeth. Though the fact that she's living forever, maybe, that who knows what that means. But that's the idea, that you should, and that authority goes together. The connection of the authority of the political agent, the king, and the authority of God. So God appointed me to be king, therefore you must obey. And every political agent in history, at least up until relatively modern times, has wanted that. I think it's still pretty common in modern times. If you look at the Old Testament, it's absolutely fascinating. You have the threefold office, if you will, prophet, priest, and king, right? So we had priests from the beginning because we're offering sacrifices. That's what priests do. But Israel didn't have a king. It had this weird system of judges, right? And the book of Judges is just strange. And there's some crisis, and God calls somebody forth, and this person, including some great women, leads the people in battle against the enemy, and then when the crisis is over, it's gone. There's no structure. I couldn't handle this. But, it's like, okay. And everybody around him has kings. And so in the book of Samuel, you get this story of Samuel's there, and the people come to Samuel, and they want a king. And the Old Testament's very ambivalent about this. Kind of two traditions come together. In some ways, it's the rural and the urban tradition. But anyhow, so the people want a king, and God talks to Samuel, and God says, I'm your king. Isn't that good enough? Well, yeah, but, everybody else has a king. Come on, I want a king, and I have a king. And Samuel's just saying, look, God, he's talking for God. Look, you get a king, here's what's going to happen. They're going to need fancy houses, big buildings. You're going to pay more taxes. They need to strut their stuff, and they start wars with other countries. Your sons are going to go off to war. And they say, I don't care, we want a king. Everybody else has a king, we need a king. Okay, so they get a king. They get Saul. At the same time they have kings, we have prophets. They come in together. And the prophets are there, basically, it's a bit overused phrase now, but to speak truth to power. And poor Saul, he's there, and he's the king, and Samuel, it's this great story. Samuel says, well, they're going to go off to battle. They're going to fight somebody. That was fighting somebody, right? They're going to go off to battle. Samuel says, I'll be there in 7 days. So the army gathers, and they're waiting 7 days, and Samuel hasn't shown up. Everybody's getting antsy, and the other troops are building, and we got to go off to war, but we can't go off to war without the blessing and the sacrifice. And so, like the 8th day, Saul says, okay, I'll do the sacrifice. And he sets up this altar, and he does the sacrifice. And, like in all great novels, as soon as the smoke has kind of died down, Samuel saunters up and says, well, Saul, what are you doing here? Well, you were late, and so I just thought I'd help out, and I can do the sacrifice. Absolutely not. That is not your role. What you have done as king is you have abdicated, you have appropriated to yourself the power of the priesthood. That may be, in fact, how kings work in all the surrounding cultures. That is not our way. And because you have done this, your seed will not inherit and you will not be king. And then he goes down and David comes in. I mean, all the poor guy did, he was trying to help out, right? But it gets at that deep human urge of power to want to be absolute. It's not enough to be king. I also want to be priest. And what I really want is to have my own prophets. I don't want these yahoos like Jeremiah showing up. I want the prophets who are going to tell me what I want to hear. That no matter what we do, in the end, God will pull our tail out of the fire. That's what the courtly prophets would say. Jeremiah said, no, you're going down. And then everybody else said, no, don't listen to him. He's a false prophet. You know, how you tell the difference at the time is a really touchy thing. But, okay, so divine right of kings. As in Louis XIV, the state it is I, right? I mean, I am the state. This is consistent, this sort of divine right of kings, very much top down, is consistent with the authority of Pope and bishops. God called, God anoints. And this, again, this top down. And one of the things that this really has going for it is that we have this organic connection across society. So we have one sense of how authority works that plays out in the family, with the father, the wife, and the children. It plays out in the state, with the king and the people, and maybe some lords in between. And it plays out in the church, with the pope and the bishops and the people. And it's the same structure across the board. It's organic, it's systemic, it's fabulous. It's comforting, it fits together, we can understand this. And it also means, as this begins to change, the church has a huge investment in keeping this structure in places that aren't the church, keeping it in society, because it believes this is all ordained by God. And that the structure of authority in the church should be the same as the structure of authority elsewhere. And in some places, it sold that so well that people said, well, then that means if I'm going to give up on this authority in the state, I guess I have to give up on it in the church too. And they feel that way because that's what we taught them. This is another form of enculturation. We're borrowing from the culture of political Europe to think about the church. And so at this time, we get all kinds of models of the church that are drawn upon monarchy. And we end up with a monarchical structure of the church, which again, it makes sense in its day. It doesn't really work in our day. What do we do with that? Okay, let's take a break here and we'll come back to the rise of democracy. Okay. The rise of democracy. But first, any questions? You might have had some questions that came up as you were milling about. I've been talking pretty relentlessly here. No? All right. We're going back at it. Okay. So around sort of moving into our own culture more, what happens is a change in how we think of authority, and more in terms of a social contract. And most of these pieces, I suspect my hunch is there's nothing here that's really surprising to you, but just how we put this together and the way it has shaped our understanding of the workings of the church. So in the social contract, authority is conferred by the people on the leaders. And again, in a way you could see it like what I mentioned in the feudal system where there's a kind of an exchange. So this idea didn't come out of nowhere, but Rousseau and Locke in particular are thinking about the fact that rather than authority coming from God and being given to the king, and in the divine right of kings, and God selected this person to be king, and that's why they're born to royal blood, et cetera, and then the king has that authority and power and can give it to others in this kind of downward flow. They said, no, the authority resides in the people. And the people confer that authority on their leaders. I mean, this is revolutionary. And it was, of course, revolutionary. So the Declaration of Independence in the U.S. is maybe the best statement of this, certainly in some concise way. There we go. So, and you know this, we hold these truths to be, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Then here, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted, that should be, among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So the idea that the government derives its power from the consent of the governed. And then Jefferson goes on to say that when the government no longer functions, basically, to secure these rights, the people can pull back their consent. So we no longer confer this power upon you. We're going to give it to somebody else or do something different with it. And if the government, if the king, refuses to accept that, then we have a fight on our hands. And that's the justification for the Revolutionary War. Okay? So it's structured in that kind of authority. Of 1776, of course, French Revolution. And at that, you know, the Europeans are a little disturbed. The Brits, of course, are real disturbed. But it doesn't affect the kind of Catholic bastion of Europe that much. In ways that always puzzled me, how they could just ignore the American Revolution. You know, but I guess that's part of probably being a white American male. I think everybody in the world is paying attention to me. And so we have this revolution and you didn't even notice? How could that be? Anyhow, but then French Revolution comes along and that definitely gets everybody's attention. French king, so we go from the state is I to no head. It's much more anti-church, in part because, I mean, the whole relationship, certainly the Catholic Church and of the church in general in the American Revolution, it didn't affect much. I mean, there's this whole separation of church and state issue, which was a problem. But here, the church aligned itself with the monarchy tightly, so that when people were throwing off the monarchy, they thought they also had to throw off the church. And the church responded exactly in kind, that the democratic forces were a threat not just to the ruling class of France, but to the social fabric of the country, of Europe, and ultimately to the authority of God and the church. Because they couldn't think of a way to imagine authority. And I'm not in any way saying that we don't have authority, we don't have power. But they couldn't think of, you might say, they couldn't imagine a metaphor for authority that was different than that of a monarchy. And because they had inadequate metaphors, they couldn't think of an alternative path forward. And that's been a huge problem for us. There were some, and we don't need to say too much about this, some in the French Revolution who thought that this was all about priests taking power, this kind of anti-Catholic piece. You can skip through that. From the beginning, Catholics, the official position of the church has been very suspicious of democracy. And at some level, it is like the idea where we're going to vote on truth. That strikes me as a rather odd idea. I mean, I'm one of those folks, I'm very uneasy about the prospects of a constitutional convention. Apparently, there's a provision of where you can amend the Constitution by the process we have with the amendments, or you can call the Constitutional Convention and rewrite the whole thing, and that's in the Constitution. And if a certain percentage of states do this, well, there have been these motions passed by a lot of states, and we're actually not that far away. I figure the only amendment we'd have left, if we did that, would be the second. The rest all gone. But anyhow, I'm very uneasy. Let's just leave it alone the way it is. So this, if you've ever been to the Minnesota State, I think it's the House of Representatives, but one of the chambers, legislative chambers. If you're in the balcony and you look out, you've got the desks and the folks down there, and then the big podiums up here. And across the back is this mural that has things from the state seal, and it's a kind of lovely thing, you know, the guy, the Star of the North, and so on. Well, there's a banner there that says, Vox Populi est Vox Dei. The voice of the people is the voice of God. All right. I like democracy. But I think it's exactly the inverse of the divine right of kings, where the king feels that they have to have the authority of God to have authority. I'm going to say, look, the voice of the people is good enough. Whether it's the voice of God or not is at some level irrelevant to our governing. It's the voice of the people, we have to deal with it. But it's the same idea that we want to appropriate to ourselves the power of God, just like Saul, just like that basic human drive, and we see this in democracy. And at some level, the church needs to say no to that. That does not because we're against democracy. You know, that's what we got confused about. We were just against democracy. Democracy was on the syllabus of errors. It's one of the errors. There was a reason that one. The other thing that was in that one of the errors was the separation of church and state. Up until the Second Vatican Council, it was the official position of the Catholic Church that error has no rights and there should not be religious liberty. If you are a Catholic and you have control of a society, you're the king or there's a Catholic majority, you do not give freedom of worship to non-Catholics. And of course, when Catholics were in the minority, we argued for freedom of worship. But that's another matter. So there was a reason why people in America thought that it might be problematic to have a Catholic president, when the official position of his church is that democracy is one of the errors that needs to be condemned, and that we're against the separation of church and state, and that Catholics in power should eliminate the freedom of worship of other people. And they want us to vote a Catholic in as president? I mean, it's not a totally baseless prejudice. There's a lot of that going on, too. There's a lot of but I mean, we gave them a lot of fodder. So Vatican I, 1869 to 70, ends rather abruptly. Some of you were here to hear Kristen Kohlberg. Isn't she fabulous? In the Vatican II presentation. You heard more about this. But the Franco-Prussian War breaks out and they all have to go home in 1870, and they never finish some of the things. But it begins with an understanding of the church as very much top-down flow of grace. And it's the Pope is an absolute monarch. Very much modeled on the lines of like Louis XIV, the absolute monarch in France. But instead of l'état c'est moi, it is l'église c'est moi. The church, it is I. Oh, okay, yeah, no. We need a little more nuance, maybe. But the authority is absolute and infallible. And what's interesting is that this is articulated precisely as the divine right of kings idea is fading from political theory everywhere. Nobody was really appealing to that anymore. And where you still had monarchs, they were constitutional monarchies, except for, Brunei or someplace like that. But, throughout Europe, they were constitutional monarchies. But what this provided in a world that was changing dramatically in the 19th century with industrialization and democratization and all these changes, this becomes an anchor of certainty in a world of chaos. And this is not just imposed from the outside. This is comforting to all of us. And in that sense, we're all part of this. And I think that we can't see this as just some elite group seizing power or something. The dynamics are much more complex than that. And so this is important. I remember in kind of this notion, Vatican II comes along, seen as undoing this. But I remember sitting in the car. My dad was a traveling salesman and just would be gone often during the week, and then run errands on Saturday, and I'd ride around with him. And I remember we stopped at the post office in Fargo. I don't know why this is so vivid. That's where we lived. But in Moorhead. I was a Minnesotan, not a North Dakotan. It was very important to me growing up. But we were at the post office, and he went in to do something, and Paul Harvey was on. And this was before the rest of the story, Paul Harvey, just when he did the news, page 3. But it was kind of engaging. Anyhow, and he was talking about Vatican II. And he was not Catholic. He was bemoaning all these changes. And he said, it's comforting to know when I walk past a Catholic church that they're doing things the way they always have, and all these Catholic churches are the same. Basically, it's comforting to me to have this anchor of certainty in some world of chaos. No, but I mean, it was kind of, that's the attitude, right? And I remember thinking at the time, so you want us to create a museum that you can visit, but you don't have to live there. I mean, it's like, is the church sort of colonial Williamsburg, only with incense? I mean, that can't be our image. But we have this desire, and we see it in people who have a nostalgia for an experience they never even had. And they get wrong. That's the other thing. I want to do it like it was in the old days. Well, then at least get it right. And one thing about that would be, you, of course, as a layperson, would not be talking. So all these folks the lay people who are complaining about the changes in the church and want to go back to the old ways, well, in the old ways, you would just sit down, shut up, and do whatever Father said. So maybe that's a good idea. Anyhow, but this notion that we're seeking this certainty. Okay, now, switch just a little bit, focus more on the U.S. history as an immigrant church. Catholics, as I mentioned, we're in a non-Catholic land. We're not always welcome. Various levels of persecution and minor persecution. But we're thrown in, would say, proudly, with the Jews and the blacks in the disparagement of the Ku Klux Klan. And it bothers me deeply that now we're off the list. And that, anyhow, I don't know what that says about us. And the idea that in an immigrant church, when we're in this kind of alien land, and the immigrants typically would come from places that were dominant Catholic cultures, Ireland, Poland, Italy, France, etc., Spain, we need to retain our identity somehow in that world. And try not to be infected too much by U.S. ways, including democracy. So we kind of we cultivate a kind of ghetto Catholicism. And ghetto doesn't mean poor necessarily. I mean, we were at the time more poor, but that's not the force of ghetto here, just an isolated group within a larger group. And in that, it's very natural to think of your identity as what makes you different. So this, for Americans, this only intensifies that whole sense of our identity is shaped by what makes us different from Protestants. And the authority of the church, that it was top down, that we had all that becomes a big part of our identity because the Protestants had this other structure. We have the authority of the Pope, and we have all this, and that makes us different. The structures are all part of that, and it goes with things like the liturgy and the vestments. The notion that this authority is not something we have and give to our leaders, but it's outside us, and we're called to obey. And there is something of that is consistent with the authority of God that's outside us and we're called to obey. And so the question ends up being the relationship between the authority of God and the authority of the church and its structures, and are they identical? Now also in this, and it's very significant part of the dynamic, the priests were often the best educated person in the community. This also goes to vocation. And again, I remember just being so struck when somebody pointed this out to me 20 years ago. This is not to get at anybody's motivation. But when you're living in this sort of ghetto world, and that it is poorer, and you want a path to education, one of the best jobs a Catholic boy could get in the community was to be a priest. You were educated, you were respected, you had some authority. It's not like you're strutting around. I don't mean that, but there's the respect of the community. It's a good job, and even economically, you live well. I remember, again, back when I was at Winona, talking to one of these seminarians, and I'm talking about his parents, and he was coming to seminary, and I said, having some vocational questions. And I said, well, your parents must be really proud of you. He said, oh, no. They don't want me to be a priest. That's a big part of the problem. This was the first time I'd ever experienced this. The record here, the student paper did an article on my becoming dean, sort of new dean, and they referred to me as Father Cahoy. And I thought, oh, my mother would be so proud. It was just a very different world. And now, they're not the best educated in the community necessarily. It's not the best economic job. And with smaller families, there's more pressure to have children and do all this, and there's other ways to serve. We're left with less and less reason to become a priest. And the fact that we have fewer priests should not be surprising in that changing circumstance. And that's not to cast aspersions on anybody. It's not about any of that. Just let's be realistic about why this happens. It's a similar pattern, exactly right. And that doesn't make those bad or inauthentic, but it's a big part of the factor, and we should expect as the social and economic conditions change. I mean, now, so we were this ghetto community. Now, if you look at the socio-economic profile of Roman Catholics in America, it's almost exactly the same as Episcopalians. We're a rich community with a lot of power. The number of people in Congress, all this kind of thing. It's very different, yeah. And so there are a lot more options. And doubly so for women. And I don't know if it's still the case, but I know a couple of years ago, it was pointed out to me that there were fewer women CEOs of hospitals at that point than there were in the 1960s, because at that time, there were so many run by sisters. And they've gone over, and those hospitals are now run by men. There are actually fewer women. Now, that may have changed in the last 10 years. But just the fact that we forget the way in which women's communities provided avenues of opportunity for women that now are available elsewhere. So a similar kind of thing for women's communities. Anyhow, this becomes significant because it gets at the attitude of our thinking of ourselves as childlike in deference to the authority of the priest. I mean, if someone is more educated, is respected in this way, and the respect is different, is more educated, you will defer to their knowledge on all sorts of things. And once that changes, that relationship changes, and that's part of what we need to reckon with. So Vatican II comes along. Again, try to be brief here, but there's a huge amount we could talk about. At the foundation, we tried to reclaim our Catholic identity from our roots and our full tradition, which went back behind the Council of Trent, and not just the last 500 years. And that was transformative. But the question, and an example, so the idea is not just what makes us different. This whole question of tradition is much more complex than it seems. And from comments that some of you made, I think this may be worth a moment here. So imagine, like the big issue, it's not that, in some ways, that big, but it's a symbol of the Vatican II changes, is the vernacular in the liturgy, okay? And so we have this Latin liturgy. Well, excuse me, you know how we got Latin in the liturgy? So in the early centuries, first couple centuries, the church moves into Rome, right, and it's growing. Well, religion is a very conservative force, so the liturgy is done in Greek. New Testament's written in Greek, so it kind of came from. So do liturgy in Greek. And the Romans are saying, well, can't we do this in Latin? Because that's what we speak. Now, I have to take it on an article of faith that there were ever 3-year-olds who ran the streets speaking Latin, but I'll believe that. But that we adopted the Latin in the liturgy because it was the vernacular. Then we go forward 1800 years, and we're having this argument about the vernacular in the liturgy. And the positions have totally reversed. And now we're saying we need to keep Latin because it's not the vernacular, because it's this universal language and it unites us, and there's a lot to be said for that. And it's beautiful and and it's what we've always done. But, okay, so we decide that we will have a Mass in the vernacular. Now, the question is, who's the real traditionalist? Everybody assumed that the traditionalist was the one defending Latin. But I don't want to concede that. I don't want to make the argument about, no, I'm for English and I don't care about tradition. No, I'm for English because I'm trying to be faithful to the deeper tradition of our community. And the deeper tradition of that community is the process of thinking about how we should pray. And when we thought about that in the 2nd century, we came to the conclusion we should use Latin. Now, are we called to be faithful to the outcome of that discussion? Or are we called to be faithful to the process of that discussion? Because if we're called to be faithful to the process by which they made that decision, we may come to a different decision and still be faithful. If our job, however, is simply to pass on the fruits of that decision and not have the guts to think like they did, we're done. And if we have the confidence that the Spirit is still with us, we should be willing to do more than just pass on the results of a prior generation's decision-making. That is the thinking like those folks standing in the Pantheon who say, we'd be lucky to pass on what was given to us. We wouldn't dare try to build this for ourselves because it would crumble. But if we believe the church is still permeated by the Spirit and it's at work in us, we should say, yes, we have the courage to think as boldly as they did. Father Don.
Is it not interesting that the broad sweep you've made since early centuries up to Vatican II, that this bubble didn't emerge until now?
Yeah, this Vatican II kind of bubble. Yeah, I think it is.
Through all of that business, whatever it was, of course, empire.
Right. The question is, it's a kind of surprising that this didn't emerge earlier. And in some ways it kind of did in the Reformation, but not the same. It isn't the same. And it was, to be careful, I'm much more comfortable pointing the finger at myself than others. But there's a way in which, it's not like throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but that the issue was too easily tradition or not tradition. And that's a position I really want to avoid. And I think that mischaracterizes the argument. The argument is more deeply about who is the real traditionalist. And that's extremely important to us here at St. John's. I do not see what we do as a kind of progressive Vatican II place as being against tradition. I see it as actually reclaiming the full tradition. As I'll say to students sometimes, look, the Benedictines were doing education for 1,000 years before there was a Reformation. That's twice as long as the time since the Reformation. Maybe there's more to our tradition than the last 400 years. Let's claim it. Yes, ma'am.
My question, the new liturgy translation, should they have been from the Greek then rather than the Latin?
Probably not, because, the Greek stayed alive in the Eastern Church, and there's Greek liturgy and Syriac liturgy and so on. But that's a kind of a different liturgical tradition, and so we're in the Latin Rite Church, and we have a Latin liturgical tradition, and it's grown since. So the Greek from the 1st or 2nd century, that liturgy, we wouldn't recognize it at all, and I'm not even sure we have much left of that. I don't know. Some of my colleagues might know. But it sort of grows over time, and then so we have this like canonized basic liturgy, which is the Paul VI liturgy after the Second Vatican Council. But the official language of the Catholic Church is still Latin. So we write these things in Latin, and then that's what it's translated from Latin to other languages. Which there's something about that. It doesn't privilege any currently active political body. You know, if it was English, it would look like American imperialism, or if it was, so this way nobody wins if it's Latin. I mean, there's a certain reason for that as long as you keep it in the right perspective. Yeah.
I was thinking about one of the conversations we had about, oh, we miss the old Latin Mass or something. And I thought, well, it's kind of like my saying I miss my childhood.
Yeah.
It was something comfortable, something new, a lot of good memories and things. And my husband and I went to a funeral a few years back, and it was a church that had an order who did the traditional
Oh, yeah.
Latin Mass. And we knew that there were many political people that came to this particular funeral, and we were embarrassed for them because they couldn't understand what was going on.
Yeah.
And
Right.
it was what the kind of big aha moment for us of why we have the vernacular.
Right.
Because all are included.
Right. No, I think that's right. It's very good. And now it's like not doing it. You're making some kind of a statement that when we did the Latin Mass in 1961, nobody was making some big political statement. You know, it's like being a fundamentalist now is different than reading the text as a fundamentalist sort of, we wouldn't even use that term, in the year 1220. I mean, that was what they did. Now you're making a statement against something. And it's all this that it's against something that colors it too. It makes it something very different than it was. So you can't pretend that doing the Latin Mass now is the same as doing a Latin Mass in 1960. Because it's a different political context, and in this context, you are making a statement that you weren't making in 1960, and it's naive to think you aren't. Now, if you want to make that statement, you know, okay, but you can't pretend it's the same. It just isn't. Okay. In this, the church claims its roots in baptism and Pentecost, and kind of inverts the pyramid in the sense that it starts with thinking of the baptized. So if you look at the document on the church from Vatican I, it began with the definition of the papacy and the infallibility of the Pope. That's why even though they didn't finish it, they got that done, because that was the first chapter, and then things moved from there. At Vatican II, the original idea was they would just start with that and finish it. And the bishop said, no, we want this redone. So you get the first chapter about the people of God, then you get a chapter on the church as sacrament, and then you get to the chapter on the church as hierarchy. You locate the hierarchical character of the church within this understanding of the church as a community of the baptized and a community of the Spirit. That's the proper place for it. And then they reaffirm the infallibility of the Pope and so on, but it's contextualized differently. Now, it's not, this is not a social contract. This isn't that we're saying, oh, and then the baptized are conferring authority on the bishop. No, we're not saying that at all. It's just a more dynamic, interactive relationship. It's kind of like in liturgy. So I think, and this was the first document that was approved by the bishops, and Father Godfrey Diekman, who many of you know, some of you had classes from him, he was so passionate about this. He was an advisor at the council, monk of the abbey here, and passionate about liturgy in the early church. And he would explain how when the bishops got together and finally realized they could write these documents the way they wanted, the whole world opened up for them. And the first one was the document on the liturgy, which got changed from the people who did the drafting of the documents coming in. And Kristen talked about that in her piece. But one of the basic dynamics, I think, that is represented in the liturgy that affects our whole thinking of the church is that Catholics went from being observers of someone else doing the holiest action of the church, which is the liturgy. So we'd go to Mass and we would basically observe the priest. And it was in Latin, so we couldn't really participate even in the prayers. So people would do private devotions. They're saying the rosary, they're doing this, they're there, but they're not really involved. We went from being observers in the holy work of the church to being participants. And I would argue, well, A, that's the work of the Holy Spirit to transform that. And everything since the council has been a continuing unfolding of that idea. As the baptized have moved from being observers of somebody else doing church to being participants. And that is hugely transformative. And that's the basis for lay ministry. All these wonderful lay students that are coming forward to do the work of the church are participating. And they moved from, there was a group, movement called Catholic Action. There was active, especially in France in the early 20th century, and it was understood as, and this is a statement of their rationale, the participation of the laity in the work of the hierarchy. That the work of the church is understood there as the work of the hierarchy. And I, as a layperson, can participate in that work of the hierarchy. This is not understood as the work of the hierarchy. It's understood as the work of the church, and the church is the community of the baptized. We are called to participate in our work, in our church, in which, just as in the liturgy, the ordained have a particular role. And we're not saying that we can, I can say Mass, but I participate. Yes, go on.
I like that we're not observers. Could you also say we're agents of the liturgy?
I think so. We have to be. Yes. Do you want to say more? That we're agents of the liturgy.
Well, because when I think of myself as a participant, I can think of myself as an audience.
Yeah.
Audience
Yeah.
will clap for what is done, but not who's doing the action.
Right.
And if I think of myself as an agent, I'm actually doing the action. So for
Right.
me, agent is stronger.
Yep. That's very good. That is very good. And it's something that I think is evident in the churches of both monastic communities. I love the Abbey Church, and it's been formative in my life. Maybe it's too austere for some. Okay, I love it. But so we don't have to go to that extreme, perhaps. But the idea is that when the church is empty, when there are no people there, it should feel empty. The icons of the church are the people. And so it's only when the people gather that you have the church. And it shouldn't look like it's okay whether there are people here or not. It should feel like something's missing when you walk in, and that place does. Anyhow, okay, let's keep moving. Within this, there is a universal call to holiness, which really gets at the agency. I can't sit back and wait for somebody else to do this. And there is a desire for a kind of representative holiness. I mean, this would be a great deal. And I think in some ways this is how a lot of us understand church. Okay, here's the deal, Father. Maybe sisters too. You do the church thing. We'll support you. We'll pay you. We'll provide what you need. You take care of that, and then leave us alone. You represent us back like that basic understanding of human religion, where the priest represents us and enters into this scary place with God and takes care of all that. You do that so we can go about our business. I think we really want that way of being church. I'd pay extra at some level. And then I'm left off the hook. And that's what I get out of it. Yeah.
This might be a future theology day, but
Okay.
as Sister Dolores brought up the agency, one of the things that bugs everything out of me is the observation during the Eucharistic prayer,
Oh.
the central prayer. And I don't know how to understand it theologically, like even with celebration.
Oh, yeah.
How many masses are being said? One of them.
Yeah, right, right.
That kind of stuff. And seven people have been asking them, they didn't get into that one either. But I think I would like, just
Yeah, very good.
That make all of us some more of an agent than we are by saying Christ died. I'm used to
Right. That's right. No, that's very good. I think
there.
let's make a note of that. Well, I think we're ambivalent. I think, yeah. And let me say this. I think one of the things about the Latin, which also goes to some ways of doing Eucharist, is it suggests more intuitively the otherness of God. So there's this sense of transcendence because we don't understand this. God is beyond what we can name. And there is some of the post-conciliar stuff, a lot of which I really liked, got a little kind of chatty and lost some of that sense of transcendence. Okay. And then we can correct that. And so the way we use language and so on. That was, in some ways, one of the initial impetuses of this new translation. So we need to preserve this otherness of God, and that's part of what we do in the Eucharistic prayer. But how to do that properly, how to do it in a way that still keeps us as agents in this. Yeah, I think something on that. We can talk about that.
A little bit of an irony for me because that's the moment when we say, oh, that's what the red flag does. How it works, right? Is God farther away or not?
Yeah, right. And it sort of keeps us, and when he's farthest away or closer to us, and good. Yeah, so the idea is the question about the Eucharistic prayer at the center of the Mass is a time when, for all the notion of agency, we become most observers. And we should it would be good for us to have a Theology Day topic when we might address some of that core of Eucharistic theology. Kind of how do we understand the Eucharist, and so on. So we're going to add. Yeah, that gets out of my specialty. The question is about at the Eucharistic prayer. You know, in the old days, the part of Mass you had to be at for it to count. So I knew you'd all know that. But at the Eucharistic prayer and the consecration and the prayers before and after that, the priest is not talking to us. The priest is praying. And, you know, it's like those prayers when somebody gets up and do a benediction or a grace and you think, you know, and it becomes like a mini sermon. And you think, really, so who's your audience here right now? Are you talking to God or are you talking to me? Does God need to know that we should? Anyhow, you know those kinds of prayers. So these are clearly prayers. And then what's our role in that? How do we relate to this? How does the rite work? And how does the whole of the liturgical action, the work of the people, function? And that's an interaction that we need to do more with. Yeah. It is power. Yeah, power is not a dirty word. Yeah, that's right. No, and I think that's a total misunderstanding. So the comment is wonderful that we need to think more about the gifts we've been given and think of this in terms of a gift culture in the church, and that we together have been given these gifts and then we have the agency to use them, and that can transform us. Actually, we can come back to that in a bit. Let me move. So then that really says that Vatican II, I think we're called to be adult Christians, and a reclaiming of what that means. Well, this is when we would have taken our break had I been on schedule. Okay, since I'm not the techiest guy, I need to point this out to you. Does this look familiar to anybody? Ben-Hur. Yeah. I found it on the web and thought, I've got to use that. It was when movies actually had intermissions, right? Okay. So now I want to, say a bit about the third element here, leadership theory. It's this fellow Ron Heifetz. You've got his books outside. The one that's where he pulls together the thoughts I'm going to draw on are primarily leadership without easy answers. He's Jewish physician, which is relevant to some stuff later, and teaches at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard and teaches on leadership, and people come from all over to take his class. And he does a lot with case studies. We'll touch on maybe one of those. There's two distinctions that Heifetz makes that I think are helpful for our thinking about the church. One is the difference between technical and adaptive change or challenges, leadership. This is what we'll spend most of our time on. We'll maybe have 2 minutes on this one, given where we're at. Leadership and authority. Yeah, but the point is, they aren't the same. So, technical change, technical leadership, technical problems. These are relatively routine problems where we have the necessary know-how and procedures to fix them, to first diagnose them and fix them. Some expert can fix the problem for us. The example pulls this together. It's like a physician. You go to the doctor, they do a diagnosis, give you a pill, you're better. It's like when you have a sore throat and you go in and you hope when they do the swab it's strep, because then they give you the pill and everything's fine. And your life goes on as before. What's happened is, and it could be far more sophisticated, maybe you need a new heart valve. So it takes a lot of expertise, but they fix it for you. The basic dynamic is, I come in with the problem, I give it to the expert takes it, fixes it, gives it back to me fixed, and my life goes on as before. I'm waiting for a call from the mechanic on my garden tractor because the expert's going to fix it. And I want my life to go on as before. So that's the idea. And that we all want these kinds of things. The patient can shift the problem to the doctor, and it goes on as before. Adaptive change, I want to talk about it first in individuals and then in organizations or systems. They're not routine. They're usually more system-wide. It's not like just one problem. It has to do with my whole body. We can't exactly fix the problem in the same way. And the example here medically might be heart disease. So I come in, here at least the doctor can diagnose it. Some of these problems we can't even diagnose exactly. But here can be diagnosed, but the physician can't fix it alone. I need to change my lifestyle. I need to exercise more, maybe change my diet, smoke less, smoke not at all. I need to adapt, right? This is a case, literally, adapt or die. What frustrates physicians is a lot of people still don't adapt. And so they'll say, we do everything right and the patient died. It's not, the doctor can't fix it for us. But the doctor has a role. The doctor should be facilitating the patient's adaptation. And good physicians know how to do this, and they know how to do it by listening to their patient. Does this person need to be yelled at? Do they need to be bribed? Do they need to be cajoled? Do they need to be stroked? What is it? When? How? So the doctor has a role. The doctor doesn't just say, well, sorry, it's all up to you. No. There is a role and in this. But we need to learn new ways of doing things. We need to adapt. And we can't go on as before. All this talk of like a new normal. Okay, this works in organizations basically the same way, structurally. The variables are the same. But with organizations, it's not like heart disease. Heifetz says the adaptive problem comes when there's a gap between our identity or our values and our behavior. We're not being who we claim to be as an organization. And he uses this great example here of Martin Luther King and JFK and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And so, I'm not JFK, Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson, wants this to be his legacy. He's from Texas. He'd love to be the person who got this Civil Rights Act passed, kind of showing the New South, doing the right thing. He feels the Kennedy legacy. He's got this opportunity, and he's not doing anything. Martin Luther King is frustrated, comes to visit him often, they talk, and Johnson just keeps saying, time isn't right, time isn't right. And King does the I've Got a Dream speech, in which a lot of this is about the gap between our behavior and our values. That's what he's calling attention to. And then there's the Selma riots. So they have the march, cross the bridge, and the sheriff turns the dogs on these marchers, fire hoses, and it's on national TV. Lyndon Johnson sees that, He calls his people on the floor of the House and the Senate, and he says, bring the bill to the floor. This is the time. Because what the American people saw was, that's not us. What we witnessed on the news, that's not us, and something has to change. Now we can adapt. And what Heifetz says is Johnson's brilliance was first that he could make this happen on the floor, but he had an intuitive sense of what Heifetz calls a holding environment, like a pressure cooker. You need to let the problem stew long enough. If you act too soon, you'll get superficial change. If you wait too long, it blows up. I mean, this is serious. And you got to read this, and you know when to act and how to act, and a leader can make a huge difference. But the leader doesn't do it all alone. So the adaptive work closes this gap between our identity and our behavior. And so what we need to do then, is part of it is that the environment around us is changing, the environment in which we're living. And you could think of this biologically, right? As like an organism, a species. The environment changes, and if that species doesn't adapt to the new environment, it will die. And what happens is some adapt, they reproduce, and pretty soon the species changes, right? So you get this kind of adaptation. But we need to do that without changing our identity. If we adapt to this environment to become totally different than what we are, we might as well have died. We did, in fact, die. We don't exist anymore. It's somebody else. So that's the challenge. It involves, then, a deep rethinking of our identity. What really is important to who we are? Because in that, then, we need to wrestle with what do we have to preserve in order to continue to retain our identity, and what can be changed in order to adapt to the new situations. And this is the dilemma of the church, right? And what's demanded here, as organizations work through adaptive change, is that there needs to be innovation and learning across the organization. So this is the organizational equivalent of the patient and the doctor working together to make adaptive change. The system needs to change. There isn't just a silver bullet, a magic pill that we can give and everything works out. And so we need the whole organization. We need participation. We can't just give it to the leader and have the leader fix it. Everybody needs to participate. And the role of the leader is to facilitate that participation rather than be threatened by it. Some leaders are threatened by the participation of the whole organization, even if those gifts, the gifts that are spread out through the organization, and whether this is a church, a small business, a family, I mean, I think this applies in lots of different ways, but those gifts are spread out. What we need is to bring all those gifts to bear on addressing our problem. And the leader does that. But there are forces at work within us that can be threatened by exactly what we need to survive. And we push away those gifts. And we move to a more technical kind of fix. Okay. I had a video, but it's not working. Let me give you a couple of examples. We can, now I get to act out the video. One of the things that organizations can do, let me go to the next, no, go back. One of the things organizations can do often is at this point of what do we change and what don't we, one response can be to kind of double down on what they do. So if you imagine like a buggy whip company in 1918, 1920, right? We're getting horseless carriages. We don't need a lot of buggy whips. Our company makes buggy whips. I'd say this is adapt or die time. But you could say no. What we do is make buggy whips, and we are going to make sure we make the best buggy whips money can buy. The highest quality. There's always a market for quality. Okay, you'll sell the 18 people that want whips, but you can't stay in business. You bet wrong. Kodak film. Finest film. They missed the digital move, and they could never catch up. They're done. They're out of business. This is you've maybe seen these. It's a Xerox commercial. And this young woman kind of gets off the subway and walks into one frame, kind of through a wall, and in this frame, all these computers. And she says, when I think of when I say Xerox, you probably think of, and she pauses just a little because she wants you to think copier. You probably think of transportation and all the support we give to the transportation companies. And then there's this like map that looks like the New York City subway and doing something. And oh, no, you don't think that. Well, maybe you think healthcare. And she's doing all this other stuff. And then she does another thing. And then she says, the last one ends with, and we're providing solutions that support the work of businesses large and small, which is pretty much what we've always done. To think of themselves not simply as a copier company, but as a company that supports businesses. They don't make what that business makes, but they can provide the kind of support you need. Like when you needed a copier, we could do that. But we aren't limited to copies. We're in the support business. It's like the buggy whip people could say, all right, there's not going to be buggy whips, but we've never made carriages, we've never made horses, but maybe we can make some part that is going to support the movement of these horseless carriages. Because we're in the transportation business. We rethink our identity. And if you rethink your identity, you actually can claim a deeper sense of who you are. You might actually discover things about your identity you didn't discover because of this environment. You adapt and you thrive. You don't adapt and you die. That's the change. And so Heifetz says the single most common leadership failure is treating adaptive challenge as if it were a technical one. And he says, get to this in another context, but he says the thing to recognize is that there is huge pressure from across the organization to treat adaptive challenges as technical. This isn't just the leaders at the top are too stupid. No. When I go to the doctor, I want this to be a technical problem. I want him to give me a pill, and I don't want to have to do anything. I don't want to do any adapting. I want him to do all the work. Here's the extent of my work. Good. I'm happy. And we have the organizational equivalent. He says there is pressure from the bottom to the top of organizations to treat problems as technical. In society, I don't want to make some lifestyle change. I want a car that gets 500 miles to the gallon. Now go fix it. It's a technical issue, not an adaptive issue. And we create that pressure. And when you mix that with a leader who wants to help out by fixing things, the leader will rush in and try to fix the problem for people because that's what we do if we care and we're kind. This is a huge temptation for anybody in a leadership position. But it can be the worst thing you can do. I'm still learning that lesson. I don't know. It's very difficult because you want to fix. I'm kind of a do-it-yourselfer guy. I like to fix things for people. But that's the challenge. I think we as a church are facing significant adaptive challenges from two fronts. Internally, maybe the theology of Vatican II, and externally, the environment. I think we can be fairly brief on the first because we've more or less talked about it. But Vatican II is, in fact, I would argue, an adaptive response to the changing environment of the church in the modern world. It really moved in the direction of adaptive change. It called for participation. It brought everybody in. The whole baptized, it reshaped our identity. It used the environment, the change in the environment, not to come to some accommodation with the modern world, but as a stimulus to claim our true identity to a new kind of faithfulness. It makes us more Catholic. I mean, at some level, as a Christian disciple and as a theologian, I don't give a rip about relevance. I don't think I should care at all about whether the church is relevant. What I need to care about is being faithful. I need to be faithful to the Christ that died on the cross and rose from the dead. All right, easy said. What does that mean? To what exactly am I faithful? There's the business. And there's a whole pattern of faithfulness, which is a faithfulness to relating to the world around you. That's why I need to relate to the world around me, because God tells me to. And I'm unfaithful if I don't. Not to be relevant. I need to care about the world around me because that's what I'm told to do. And that's how I'm faithful. It's a different dynamic. But that's what Vatican II does. Believe that Vatican II is clearly the work of the Holy Spirit. It gets at our Catholic identity in basic ways. All of this saying this is an adaptive exercise. And it empowers the baptized to be full members of the church. Adult members of the church. And that's where we get the theme of participation. Now, more from the environment, and this is where we can harvest some of the history work that we've done. One of the realities of our environment is that we're not a ghetto church. We have an increasingly educated laity. People have professional responsibilities. They go from being CEOs and CFOs and HR directors and so on of major companies, and they come into church and they're treated like they're 8 years old. And they feel like I have to turn off this when I enter the church. And this is a challenge. And maybe in the past there wasn't as much turning off because you didn't have that kind of transition in that sort of ghetto understanding of the church. But now it's different. And how do we harvest these gifts for the good of the church? There's a declining number of priests and religious, which create, if you will, a space for people to step forward and do more. We need to do more. I mean, the reality is, if you look at the typical Catholic parish in 1963 and the typical Catholic parish in, say, 2003 or 2013, but we don't need that whole space, and you look at the kind of amount of ministry going on in those two parishes, there's way more happening in the parish in 2003 in a world in which we've had fewer priests and religious. Now, I'm not saying there's a cause and effect there. I wish we had more priests and religious. But what has happened is people have realized, and this ties in with Vatican II, that if the church is going to do the work the church is called to do, we have to do it. How are we going to do this? Let's figure it out. So we come up with structures. And like Cornelius and Peter, the official church is always racing to catch up to the work of the Holy Spirit. There's work being done in the church by all kinds of people who are called to do it. And I think the third environmental factor is the whole clergy sexual abuse and the response of our leaders. I mean, the abuse itself is bad enough. But we can come to terms with sin and its immediacy, even as repulsive as it is. But when the leaders didn't react in any way that showed that they were appalled or cared about the things that others of us care about, that was more than disillusioning. It eliminated the idea that the relationship here is parent and child and, just trust us. No. We want transparency. We want accountability. And when you look at documents and you read some of the rationale given, one of the reasons that bishops said over and over they didn't want to make this public is because it would scandalize the faithful. They were afraid that we couldn't handle it. They thought we were like 5-year-olds. And they treated us that way, and they made decisions that way. And they created a worse situation than they feared. And that dynamic is what has to change. And I think people realize that we can no longer think like this. Now, it's one thing to say, if you're, as parents, there are things you may not talk to your children about when they're 4, 5, and 6 that you will talk to them about when they're 24 or so. It's different. And I think that's part of the challenge here. So this experience in these various ways, all of these, affect our expectations of authority and power. What do we expect? And we expect more accountability. Accountable to whom? Accountable to God. Yes, absolutely. We're all accountable to God. But we have structures of accountability where maybe there's an accountability to other people, to overview boards like we have on sexual abuse and other kinds of things. How does this power work? It isn't as simple as straight down. The church is not a democracy. That's true. But it's not a monarchy either. What is the model that we might use for understanding this? What metaphors can we draw upon? And all of this calls for more lay involvement as responsible adults in the church. And we have to stop acting like children. And I think that part of what we created over time is a system that for all sorts of reasons tends to treat the baptized as children. That's one of those social forces that's at work on us. And we all get caught up in that. Whether that's true or not, it's certainly how it's perceived and felt by many people who feel like they're being treated like children. Now, and I think the answer would be no there. We don't have to be childlike. We don't have to be children, or childish, certainly, but don't have to be childlike to be true Catholics. Now, part of the reality is the leaders are also caught up in this system. And I'd say that a lot of the training, I think it's changing now, but the people we have are the fruits of earlier training. A lot of the training in seminary and other ways did not prepare people to deal with people in the pews as adults. It just was not a natural way to think about this. And so people get caught up in this system and have not been prepared to lead a church of adult Catholics and adult disciples. I think in some ways it's like well-meaning parents, many of us, who can have a hard time relating to their children as adults. I mean, I go home and I'm still a kid in some ways. And there's some things about that are really nice. My mom would probably do my laundry. I don't stay long enough. But, I mean, that sort of, so, and this is the thing, this dynamic throughout, it's too simple to say it's like they won't let me. No, I'm complicit in this. There are times when I like a system that lets me be a child. Because, I really don't want to have responsibility for all this. I think I'd rather have Father do it. What I really, really want is a system that enables me to be a child and also whine about it at the same time. And I think in some ways that's what we've got. I complain about being treated like a child, and yet I am complicit in that. So being an adult ultimately means being responsible. Means many things, but means being responsible. And if we're adults, we need to act like it. Take responsibility for our church. We don't have many structures or models for exercising this responsibility. This is a huge challenge. I remember I did my undergraduate studies here at St. John's, and I had this memorable class from Father Killian McDonald, who's still around, and he, back from the council and really hot stuff, jetting off to do these ecumenical dialogues and all this stuff. And we had to have it on a Tuesday night, which I point out to the faculty in the School of Theology that night classes in the School of Theology didn't just begin in the last decade, but Killian did this. And we had 5 seminarians who came up from Luther Seminary, and it was fabulous. And it was on ecclesiology. And he talked about all the changes in the church and at the council and the inversion of the pyramid and all this. He said, problem is, we have centuries of canonical structures built up that get the word and the power from the top down. We have no structures or canons at all for how the voice goes from the people up. And until we get that, the reforms will not really take hold. I think that was a pretty accurate prediction. Well, and I think that's part of what I want to do with this. One of my goals is that, like right here, so like getting that sentiment up. There's limited amount that we can do to change some of those things. There's some pressures, forces people can put in various ways. But I wouldn't want it to be that if I can't change big issues, I can't change anything. Or I can't be responsible. So I don't have the responsibility to make the kinds of decisions that the Pope or the bishops in council have, so I have no authority. And my argument is, no, we do have some authority and we do have some responsibility. And if we think of change as local, we think of politics as local, what can we do in our local parish? If there's things that we see that need doing, like let's say you feel that your parish needs to spend more time on youth. As my friend Craig Dykstra from the Lilly Endowment has said, thriving communities overinvest in their young people. And if our parish isn't doing that, I can't imagine a priest who would stop you if you went out and raised the money and said, here it is, and all we can do with this is hire a youth minister, and we want this to happen, and we're going to have a committee that's going to support this person so they're not on their own. There's a lot you can do to increase the amount of energy in your parish without waiting for somebody to tell you. And so I think, and yet these other things continue, but I think we don't have to have the issues always be, I'm frustrated with those things that are beyond my reach politically. There are things we can do that are within our reach, and we're responsible for either doing or not doing those. And I think we can think about what those might be as we go forward. So, but we don't have a lot of models here, and we need to think about how that works. This, and I mentioned earlier, people resist this. So we want to shift responsibility for bad situations back onto the leaders because, as I said, we want to be able to act like children sometimes and still complain about it. We want to make somebody else responsible, and they are responsible for some things that I can't change. But there are others. I wanted to read a quotation that you might have seen in the news. It came out on May 5th. And then we can wrap this up. But Cardinal Braz de Avis, he is the head of the Vatican Consecration for Institutes of Consecrated Life and Societies of Apostolic Life, basically for religious. Okay. Vatican congregation, like a cabinet level post. Okay. And he's been there since 2011, and he spoke to 800 leaders of women's religious communities that had gathered in Rome at the beginning of May. And he first of all spoke about how saddened he was at the fact that when they had this visitation of the sisters in North America or in the United States, he was never consulted, even though this is his area. He was very sad about that, pained, he said. He hadn't spoken out earlier, which probably says something about something has maybe changed in the Vatican. But at one point, he called for a wide-ranging review of structures of church power. He said, we are in a moment of needing to review and revision some things. Obedience and authority must be renewed and revisioned. Authority that commands kills, he continued. Obedience that becomes a copy of what the other person says infantilizes. Misunderstood obedience turns us into infants. And we need to review the structures of authority. This coming from the head of a Vatican congregation. I find this rather amazing. And it was published. NCR published it. And the story actually gets better. So then the Vatican came out with a correction and said, that NCR had misquoted him and that, this isn't what he meant and so on. The kind of usual giving him an out. He said, no, they quoted me absolutely correctly, and it was very important that they did so. Maybe things are changing. All right, 1 minute now on leadership and authority, because I think it's relevant, and then I'll turn it over to Grace. So Heifetz's second distinction is about leadership and authority. And he says that they're not the same, and we shouldn't assume they are. Sometimes they go together, but not always. There are people and institutions that can lead without having formal authority. I suspect you've all been in those situations. You're at a meeting, you're in some gathering, and there is that person or persons to whom heads naturally turn, and it's not always the person who's in charge. Sometimes that can create a problem, other times not. You have to handle that well, but you get a sense of that. And a lot of that leadership goes with taking responsibility. I mean, many of the students that we have who are going out to serve in parishes and in all sorts of ways in the church may not have positions of formal authority, but we are preparing them to be leaders. And the people in their communities will look to them as leaders. So this distinction is very important to us. This is in many ways looping back to what monasteries and religious communities have done. They have exercised leadership in the church even though they don't occupy a position of authority. And I think that's part of what we've done here at St. John's over time. But you've heard that story before. So Grace wants to speak with you. I'm around. It kind of came to an abrupt end here, but our time is up. We need to think about what we can do to exercise leadership in the church as adults who take responsibility for our church. And like adults, we don't have to wait for somebody to give us permission to be an adult. And we don't have to say, I can't do this because they won't let me. You can make a lot of things happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. That was great. All right, before we eat and pray, you get to listen to me for a little bit. But actually, I have a treat for you. In 1 Peter 3:15.
Oh, that's me.
Give a reason for your hope or send the dean to the speaker so that you pay attention to me. Okay. 1 Peter 3:15 tells us we should always be ready to share the hope that is within us. Here at St. John's School of Theology and Seminary, our hope is in our students. And I thought it would be very appropriate to share with you a video of one of our students who gave a testimony of her thankfulness at our St. John's Day recently in April. So if technology works.
Picture it. A lake resort, retreat center, house of prayer, and institution of higher learning. Is this heaven, you may ask? No, it's St. John's University. My first experience of the School of Theology Seminary was a visit more out of curiosity than anything. I had heard many positive things from colleagues and friends about St. John's, particularly due to its strong liturgy program and my background as a liturgical musician. So I thought, why not check it out? Little did I know that after being on campus for a mere few hours, I would be sold on applying to the master's program in theology. From the first moment I walked in Emmaus Hall, I was home. People were friendly and went out of their way to greet me. The class I attended was taught by an engaging and brilliant young woman, So much so I actually started taking notes in her class. That's true. And the students were equally invested in the discussion. Students, faculty, staff, monks, religious sisters attended midday prayer as a community. Together, all ages gathered. Those recently graduated from college, young professionals returning to school after working several years in ministerial or other settings, parents with adult children feeling called to a career change or deeper theological studies. Even those near retirement age were present. They came from all corners of the globe: India, China, South Korea, the Caribbean, from all corners of the United States, New York, California, Montana, Pittsburgh, Texas, and everywhere in between. They came from many religious denominations: Roman Catholic, Lutheran, Assemblies of God, Episcopalian, and United Church of Christ. Here, the body of Christ gathered, breaking bread and sharing stories. Christ was truly among us. Following prayer, a meal was cooked by everyone, by students. There was laughter, there was joy, and without question, a closely knit community. People took a sincere interest in learning more about me and what brought me to St. John's that day. My only mistake was confessing that my undergraduate degree was obtained from the University of St. Thomas. Yes, I was a Tommy in disguise. Luckily, people were still very nice to me. A few jokes, but otherwise, nice to me. But wait, there's more. The St. John's Bible, liturgical press, people I had idolized who were on the faculty whose publications I had read. Who knew that rural Minnesota had such a hidden gem? Maybe this was a slice of heaven. In sharing my own personal story, I have already named the Benedictine values that are being lived out every day at St. John's. Hospitality, community living, awareness of God, respect for persons, listening, and more. The education I'm receiving at St. John's is more than an intellectual endeavor. It is a transformative education, one that shapes and integrates the mind, body, and spirit, and one that prepares students for further academic studies and life in real ministry. The students who leave the School of Theology are changing the world, literally, as they return to all corners of the globe to share what they have learned. Go and make disciples of all nations, Jesus tells us in the scriptures. Without question, St. John's is accomplishing this task. The support each one of you has given to the university is truly monumental. Without you, St. John's could not do the wonderful work that it does. And as you know, with student debt skyrocketing every year, myriads of students would not be able to attend this university without your generous support. I can tell you that without the help of the scholarship I received, I would not be standing before you today. In the coming months, I will be graduating and beginning a position, as was mentioned, as the Director of Liturgy and Music at Xavier University in Cincinnati, Ohio. There, I will empower students to live the gospel and change the world, just as St. John's has empowered me. On behalf of myself and the students in the School of Theology Seminary, I want to express our sincerest gratitude for all that you do for this university. Words cannot express how eternally grateful we are. I conclude with a song that I have sung many times in worship that I believe speaks to what St. John's embodies and achieves through its education. We are learners, we are teachers, we are pilgrims on the way. We are seekers, we are givers, we are vessels made of clay. By our gentle, loving actions, we would show that Christ is light. In a humble, listening spirit, we would live to God's delight. Thank you, and may the risen Christ bless you each and every day in all that you do.
She leaves me speechless. If that doesn't motivate you to give, there would be absolutely nothing else I could tell you. To open up those red folders, and you will see an envelope in there to help us with scholarships. Not only does your support help our students, remember that our annual fund helps us to continue these theology days. So with your help, we can continue to reach out and do more theology days and gather more of us together. All right, so with that, I just want to thank you on behalf of our students. I join Rochelle in saying thank you so very much. It is so important to our students for this scholarship, and I really hope that that rains out with the words that she shared with you.